Paris was besieged by Prussian troops. Bizet du.
Okay, I would like to call to order the Wednesday, July 13th, 2016 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. And we'll begin with approval of the minutes of June 22nd, 2016.
I'd move to approve.
A second.
Any additions, corrections, or deletions? I forgot to ask that. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, motion minutes approved. Let's see, correspondence. Mike, is there anything?
Maybe just that we've got shared readings up.
Oh, right,
So.
yeah. Yeah, just to comment on that for a second, Mike and I did some digging around in terms of complete streets because there was an interest among commission members for that, and I found literally many dissertations on the subject, and to save people time, and we found some articles that Smart Growth puts out that really just kind of tickle the subject, introduce it, explain what complete streets are. They have lots of links, and you can go as deep into it as you want, or just get the sort of overview of what it really is about and some examples. But there's links into things like how do you develop a policy for your own community, things like that. But you can start maybe if we have time at the next meeting. It would be nice to have a discussion at least about complete streets and what we think about them and whether we want to be involved in anything further with it. So that's up and ready to go. Transportation Commission meeting report.
We haven't met for a while, and I believe we're scheduled to meet in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Thursday at 4 in this room.
Okay, and I think we decided we're not going to be meeting on that Wednesday, so we'll talk to you about it in August. So where are we? Wow. Okay, open microphone. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to the Commission regarding matters not on the agenda or currently pending before the Planning and Zoning Commission. And do we have any takers in the audience? Okay, well, it's a reminder to anyone who might be watching the broadcast that you are welcome to come down here and let us know what you're thinking about during this time period. Okay, well, that takes us to approval of relevant criteria and standards. And Mike's going to take us through that. For the planned unit development upon an approximately 6-acre parcel generally located south of Paradise Creek and east of Main Street on Highway 95 for a mixed-use development that includes 154 multifamily residential units and a 3,000 square foot commercial retail building with 3 tenant spaces. So Mike is going to go through the proposed state relevant criteria and standards for that.
Yeah, this is just per the Commission's direction last time. It was the Identity on Main PUD that we heard last meeting and conducted a public hearing. And so this is just the follow-up approval of relevant criteria and standards. And so we've just taken our best shot at drafting it and including the criteria and standards at the end, as well as the 5 conditions that came along with approval that night.
So are there any questions or additions? I have a question, but maybe we'll see if anybody else does first. And anybody? No. The question I have maybe isn't directly for approving this or not approving this, but I'm just wondering, the one soft area to me, at least I don't know where it's spelled out, is what is sustainable development. To me, it can be many things, and what I see listed are pretty much what you would expect any good quality development in this day and age to reflect. So as an architect, I have a hard time looking at this and saying, what's the big deal about what they're doing in terms of sustainable development? You should be doing this anyway. So, do we look at have we adopted anything to define what we really mean by sustainable development? Or since they're getting a 4%, bonus for compliance with sustainable development. Where does that criteria come from?
We have what we've adopted for the City of Moscow is the Green Building Program, and so through the International Code Council, they have the program that local municipalities can adopt, and that's
based on LEED standards, or
it's not LEED. It's based upon the ICC, so it'd be building code oriented. So you kind of have the two. Their green standards, and then you have a separate LEED standards. The difference is you've got to pay a second party, consultant to verify LEED standards, whereas the city walks you through. The building department has a checklist, and they go through all of the factors that you need to incorporate with your plan, and then it's like a calculate at the end and make sure it's meeting the criteria. And so that's what we typically do for our green building program, and then we give you a plaque and you can display on the residence and or whatever project it is. So that would be our own standards, but I know that they had adopted that quite a few years ago. It was before I got here, and I think Jim Johnson was the building official that ended up doing that, and they just thought it was advantageous just because you don't have to pay the additional money in order to have somebody come out and field verify that it meets a LEED requirement. So that's the standard that we go off of.
It's a pretty good program, really.
It is,
It covers a lot of ground.
and if you just go a little bit above the typical construction that we see here, for at least for single-family dwellings,
You're automatically
you can
bronze.
get in pretty much in there. It's just changing a few things that you do, and making sure that there's no energy leaking and everything's you got a duct. We have a duct blaster that goes and tests to make sure you don't have any leaks in your HVAC system, and there's a lot of items that the building department has that are part of this program that are just free to anybody that's interested in going that route.
So most of it is connected to the actual construction of buildings rather than site planning decisions, et cetera.
No, that's one of the elements too, is the siting on the lots or lawn.
Yeah, it's not really clear in this drop list.
That's the best place to look, though. I think if you were curious, is to just because it covers is it 5 things or 7? Like water conservation is one.
For the sustainable
energy,
development
yeah.
and PUD. Yeah, it would be energy conservation, materials and resources, indoor environmental quality. Water-saving fixtures, alternative mode of transportation.
Yeah, that's one that was.
So,
that
which
ended up
discusses, alternative modes of transportation to decrease automobile usage or traffic. Bus shelters, turnouts, alternative fuel vehicles, support facilities, carpool lots, pedestrian paths, bike racks, etc. Maybe awarded up to 2%. So there's a lot of categories underneath the sustainable development that.
So how do they, I guess it's not so much to criticize this proposal as to try to understand how do you determine 4%? I mean, is there a value placed on each criteria, or is it just kind of an overall decision? I mean, just a kind of...
It would just be, a lot of it would be up to the discretion of the commission. It gives you direction and says you're allowed to award up to 15% of the base density off of these factors. So, looking through and looking at the proposal, consulting with the building department, and looking at all the percentages, staff usually renders an opinion as to how much should be awarded, and that was kind of on the low side. I think that they probably could have been awarded a little bit more. It's just that they with what they did. I think they definitely should have been awarded 4%, and then with the additional landscaping and open space, 3%. So
I'm coming
we were definitely
into this with a stronger value system, in the sense that I don't think any of these things shouldn't be part of any project. I mean, anymore in this day and age.
Well, it talks about energy conservation up to 6%, additional R value. Energy Star windows, Energy Star HVAC systems. A lot of these are what you see in development is maybe just code minimums.
Right.
And you only have to go a little bit above to get, increase these standards. And so, that's what the Grove, I think they went through a PUD down there for the campus grass, the Grove. And part of their proposal was energy conservation type plan, so low flow fixtures, extra insulation, all Energy Star rated appliances and everything. So it's pretty similar to that, but they're going higher than what they did. So.
Okay, thanks.
Would it be difficult to, probably would, instead of having it be a judgment call as to what % of bonus you're going to award through the department, to make it something that has a matrix that says, well, if you've achieved this and you achieved that, that is prescribed.
It's more quantifiable.
So that if I came along later and wanted to build something similar and you didn't give me 4%, I could say, well, geez, mine's even better than, where there's not a judgment call involved.
Mm-hmm.
That would be, it seems like that would be a tough thing to create, but it also seems like it would be a little more fair to whomever.
Well, I mean, like LEED picks, you have to meet certain values in multiple categories across the spectrum instead of maybe you put all your marbles on just saving energy and nothing else, and so it requires more of a distribution.
But LEEDs really isn't part of what the city can
Right, I understand that, but I'm just using it as a model in my mind of how they quantify, sort of do what you're talking about.
Yeah, in your spare time, Mike, could you come up with a point system?
I don't know.
I was about to open my mouth and say with the upcoming code amendment when we're working on the land use matrix that it could maybe fit in. But yeah, we have to take a look at it. This hasn't, the PUD section hasn't been something that's been on our radar just because it seems like it's been working fairly well. So we don't see too many of them come through. So but yeah, I agree that
it seems a little arbitrary.
There is some judgment
it
involved.
Seems very difficult to be.
And has the green
that much
building
more
program
definitive,
been
too.
updated since then, since the original? Because that's back when we were building.
I would imagine that it's updated every time we adopt a new code, but I would have to check with Micah on that.
Seems to me that the original PUD ordinance did have a little bit more detail, and I think some of that detail disappeared, partly because it's very difficult to come out to do that detail.
Yeah,
I think the commission in the past has been sort of willing to lay that on the. You guys.
Right. Well, it would seem like what makes the most sense for our commission is more the site planning decisions and things that affect parking requirements or landscape requirements rather than building per se, which really goes with the building permitting. But
however, PUD does encompass both.
True. Yeah. So.
Well, I know that we did. They had originally sent us a real general description about what like R value insulation and what the things they were doing in order to utilize that bonus. And I know that we had sent it back to have them give us more information about just to tie them down on exactly what they were proposing, just so they couldn't just speak broadly about we're going to have energy efficient appliances. Well, what standard does that meet? And and high insulation. So we did, we usually ask for specifics on those items when we do get them. So.
Well, that helps. Thank you. I was just wondering.
Yeah.
Yeah, you remember off the top of your head what their R values were?
I know they listed it on the cover sheet, but I can't, not off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, the other one that's sort of ambiguous is recycled content in building materials. I mean... Yeah, I mean, you could you could reuse a window sash somewhere and you have recycled content. So how do you what is that? How do you define that? I didn't see anything in the flashy 3D drawings that we looked at that looked like recycled content, but maybe there is. So that raised my eyebrow a little bit.
One of the big things on the city's green building code with material use is designing it so that you're like using full sheets of plywood or drywall or full lengths
So
of studs,
efficiency
and so
more
you're
than-
not
yeah.
you're not shaving off a foot and it goes in the trash. And so it's a lot with the design work to save, even though it's new materials. Don't be wasting the new materials.
Yeah.
Okay. So are there any other questions or comments throughout?
I think one brief comment. Normally, I'd be really nervous about voting on this where I wasn't at the presentation, but I think this actually strikes me as a good enough project that I will have no hesitation for doing that tonight, just because of the things of the reduced parking, the real encouragement for alternate forms of transportation. I mean, I think this is the first project that really does that I know of. So we can see how it works. I like the idea that they're having the pool cars there, available. That's a great camel's nose under the tent. That could start quite a few things. The paying serious attention to bicycle parking. I really like that. I think if they've upped the insulation and truly upped the energy efficiency of things above and beyond, that's fabulous too.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great project, and I think it's a great one to hopefully get people thinking. Like you said, everybody should be doing this, but you got to have one that's out there that's working to really encourage people to do it. So that's all.
Other comments? Or, it looks like to me, it looks like you captured the spirit of our discussion really well. So,
I'm willing to move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Well, we've approved the relevant criteria and standards for the plan unit development on the Troy Highway and Highway 95. So, Mike, the next item on the agenda is off-street parking, the draft ordinance, and we'll take a look at it.
Well, I just wanted to briefly go over the landscape section at the end. I think that was the last section that we had gone over. Right. And there were just a couple comments, some slight changes to that section. And I wanted to give you another look at the entire off-street parking. I think we're still going to proceed with taking this to an advisory committee like we did the street tree committee and get some contractors and some landscape, maybe architects and landscape contractors to give some input, as well as some developers on the parking requirements. So I just wanted to give you maybe one last shot at taking a look at it. We'll go and take it to that committee, form that committee, take it to them, and then we'll bring it back, obviously, with their recommendation, and then we'll just go from there. But I think looking at the Section F, landscaping requirements, this is what we looked at last time. I think you had a comment about updating the purpose statement at the beginning, as well as looking at the interior and exterior landscaping sections, adding some language about conflict with parking lot lighting, as well as security for sight distance as vehicles are maneuvering around the parking lot. So I've tried to do that the best I can. So I changed, what you had before for the purpose. It was kind of antiquated, but we said that the landscaping is more for aesthetics. Landscaping requirements to promote attractive off-street vehicular parking areas in the city, promote traffic safety, and to protect and improve the appearance, character, and value of the surrounding neighborhoods, and thereby promote the general welfare. So that's how they were tying it back to the general welfare of the city. So what I've done is gone in. I kept a little bit of that, but included a lot of those things that we talked about before. So the purpose of these landscape requirements is to promote general welfare of the public by reducing noise levels and glare, filtering stormwater runoff, reducing urban heat island effect, filtering vehicular emissions, stabilizing soils to help with erosion and flood control, providing shade to users of parking lots, promoting safety by directing traffic circulation, promoting attractive off-street vehicular parking areas in the city, and to protect and improve the appearance, character, and value of the surrounding properties and neighborhoods. This objective is to be accomplished by providing external landscape buffers between parking areas and adjoining land uses, and by providing landscape islands in the interior of parking lots. So that was kind of my crack at updating the purpose.
I think it's
about.
great.
Okay.
Yeah, nice
Good.
job. Much more comprehensive.
Yeah, I think it
Yeah,
covers a
yeah.
lot of those things, and when you think back and look at it, I mean, it accomplishes all of those, and there's
Yeah.
really a lot that parking lot landscaping, contributes to, not just the aesthetics of the area. So,
Right.
Water retention.
I wasn't here at the meeting that we had the last conversation about this. But what I had been wondering when I was reading through our packet is when the buffer is between the parking lot and like a street right away where there could be power lines over the top, I have a concern about the choice of trees, because even on Highway 8 with all the work they did a couple years ago, they planted new trees that are already getting really close to the power lines, and it's like that's a lot of money spent, and the trees are going to get hacked up just like they've been hacked up all over town. So I don't know, is there some way to incorporate that kind of consideration into the ordinance?
I think that'll be more of an issue with city street trees. So I think the Tree Commission is currently working on updating their arboricultural specifications and urban forestry manual, which will have, right now if you look through the manual, there's probably about 100 trees in there, and so it gets a little overwhelming, I know, when I look through it. And they're looking at updating that to reduce it to about 10 species that are native to our area, and in certain circumstances. So just in the power line scenario where you have a tree that maybe shouldn't grow all the way up to 50 feet in height because you have power lines. They'll have scenarios for all of those things, and then they'll have recommended trees, and then it'll have to be approved through our urban forester
So
in order to plant those.
would that superimpose over this or work in conjunction with this if it happened to be a parking lot and then the tree berm and then a city street or a highway?
Yeah, all the utility lines should be in the public right-of-way, and this will all be on private property from where the trees are going to be.
Okay, so this we're just
if
investing
there's
private
a
property.
conflict where there'll be, some circumstance, maybe it's an older piece of property where you have maybe a conflict, we can identify that and work with our urban forester to try to manage that.
Okay.
But that's Tree Commission, I think, has been working on that over the last year in order to give a recommended, and then he has to approve everything that's planted in the public right-of-way. So he'll be taking a look at that.
Even if it involved a parking lot, he would be the one to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then all new development, everything's underground now, so hopefully we don't continually run into those issues. Like all the new subdivisions, everything is in ground. So hopefully we don't have any lopped off trees like
our neighborhood.
our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And then I think nothing else changed except for including a sentence, and I tried my best to. I think Joel gave a little bit of language at the last meeting, and so I put in there, consideration shall be given to the selection of trees and shrubs that at maturity do not present vehicular site obstructions at driveway, street intersections. So I think that's for the external. I think that, in external landscaping, I think those are really the only conflicts you're going to have is the driveway that accesses the property going out to the adjacent street. And then looking at the required interior landscaping, a similar statement that says consideration shall be given to the selection of trees and shrubs that at maturity will not interfere with parking lot lighting or present vehicular site obstructions. So best shot at that one. So those are really the only changes. We still have to get a figure 1 in there. We talked at the end of the landscape island section about just to clarify that if you have a landscape island that's adjacent to 2 bays like that, you need to include 2. This would be 1 bay and this would be another. So we just need to include a figure. We've yet to do that on the computer, so that'll be inserted right here just to give a little bit of visual towards that section. But other than that, I don't think that we've incorporated everything as we've incrementally gone through this section, and so take some time and look through it and see if there's anything else that comes to mind. But we'll have another shot at it after we kind of work it through the steering committee and bring it back and move forward with it. So.
Thank you. Any questions for Michael? Other ones? Okay.
I think that's good progress.
Yeah. So non-conformity use draft ordinance is next on the agenda.
So we talked last time about updating our whole non-conforming section of the code. I'm still working on that, but we have a recent request from the county, and I made copies of the letter that they had sent down. Here, you can pass that around. But what the Director of Planning and Building, Michelle Fuson, is requesting an adoption. So within the area city impact, we have adopted or agreed upon codes that we utilize. They're usually city codes that the county has adopted in order so that as the city expands, that a lot of these properties that are being reviewed right now that are out in the county, if they're being reviewed up against the city codes, then it's a lot stronger of a likelihood that when they do get annexed into the city, they're not going to have any non-conforming issues associated with them. So we haven't updated that since about 2006. We're currently kind of in discussions between the city council and the Board of County Commissioners in order to update that, but they're, I think, waiting for another year or so before they update it. But in the meantime, I guess there was a more of an urgent issue that they had identified working with a property owner in the area city impact, that they would like the city to adopt their non-conforming uses section in their county ordinance to be adopted within the area city impact. And so you can read through the letter, but looking at that section of the code, it's a little bit different than ours. Right now, we're obviously in the process of taking a look at our non-conforming section and maybe updating that to be a little bit more lenient. But the way theirs reads right now in regards to non-conforming dwellings is that any non-conforming single-family dwelling that exceed the permitted residential density may be expanded or replaced regardless of size if the new or enlarged single-family dwelling unit conforms to all our provisions of this ordinance. So if it is in existence right now, they would allow it to be replaced should it be torn down or burnt down. They have a stipulation as long as it's been there for about a year immediately prior to the replacement, then they're allowed to rebuild it. I guess granted that they meet all other city or county codes, which would be primarily setback requirements. So I think the issue was this property on Yeoman's Lane, and they have, I guess the non-conforming aspect is that they have 2 houses out there right now. It's one family, the Yeomans, and they have a house here and they have a house over here. It's a father, and then the son has the house here. And they were looking at tearing one of the houses down and rebuilding. And so that was the issue. The route, I guess, they would go through, it's ag forest, so there's a 40-acre minimum lot size. I think the property is about 9.5 acres in size right now. So the only option for them right now would be to maybe request a rezone to a zoning district, maybe suburban residential that has a minimum 1 acre size, and then they would have to subdivide it into these large lots in order to be able to build another house. When we talk this through with the county, I think that it would be advantageous to, I think, the city as well as the county in order to adopt this provision, just because of the future growth of the city. It becomes more problematic when you have parcels divided up into these smaller lots, and then how you get roads and city services onto the next big parcel as they develop. Once you go ahead and divide those into maybe 2-3 larger pieces, it just becomes a lot more challenging in order to be able to do that. And so that was our take, was that right now we may relax our non-conforming section in order to be able to allow that in the city. Maybe if it burns down, you may be able to replace it. But in the time being, they were looking for us to, or the city to, adopt this within the area city impact, enabled, in order for them to be able to do this. And I think Michelle goes through the letter and kind of recaps what we talked about. She had some other opinion in there about beneficial to families because it will allow for continuation of use of homes that are on farm properties, allows for multi-generational living, and allows for continued preservation of agricultural lands. So we couldn't really see any downsides of not allowing that, and it would be better for us, in our opinion, in order to have this one large piece instead of multiple, smaller pieces.
So would the expansion, obviously, you'd be using the existing building, but if it were a replacement, does it need to be on the same location? Is that part of it?
That's not the way it reads. I think that I think the direction we were going to go, or at least in our preliminary research, at least within the city, was that if maybe you have a non-conforming house and it burns down, right now you can't rebuild it. It would have to be,
so you can't get insurance.
You wouldn't be able to get it.
Right.
What I think that the direction we were thinking about going was to limit the size of the rebuild to what it currently is, which this appears to not do that. They specifically say that it could be expanded or replaced regardless of size. So
I was just wondering if, because of the consideration of not wanting to have it rezoned, because that could mess up future transportation, if one of those places was what they chose to tear down or burn down, and then they wanted to move back somewhere else in the 9 acres. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
I
I think that, and I thought about that as well. They've indicated that they wish to rebuild in the same location. Looking at the property, they've got a draw that comes right down the middle, and I would imagine that the soils there are wet at certain times of year and wouldn't be conducive to putting a foundation or a house out there. So, it would either here or there. And I think that, our I guess, larger concern would be the extension of Lanny Lane all the way and to eventually connect with Darby, because, our long-range transportation plan has that going pretty much through this draw and then up and connecting with the intersection of Mountain View and Darby. And so with any house plan that gets reviewed by the city, we recommend they'll send it down to us and we'll make a recommendation. But that'll be one thing that we'll be looking at with a close eye, is making sure that that's not going to somehow affect that future extension of Lanny over to Mountain View. So,
any idea how many parcels could kind of run into this same sort of situation?
I don't know. I would imagine that there's quite a few out on Polk Street, and I think it's mainly these areas that were primarily county, or still county, but the city's just slowly starting to encroach upon them, and that's where we've run into issues in the past. If you look on the development on, right at the adjacent, the Polk development, where you have a lot of 1 acre size lots, and in order to expand beyond that point, it's just going to start to become really problematic to run city services out there.
I'm sure I speak for all my neighbors when I
yeah,
say
I know.
we're just heartbroken about
Yeah.
that.
But yeah, it just because of the large expense of maybe running services all the way up to maybe a larger piece that they'd want to subdivide. Development's just going to go somewhere else, and it'll end up being northeast of town, northeast and east of town, just because of it's a lot easier to run logical and orderly extension of the city without the lot size that are 1 acre in size and more, and so.
And my other question would be, if they had to go the rezone and subdivide part, wouldn't that do horrible things to their tax bill?
I don't know. I would imagine. I mean, we would. I would imagine that they don't want to be in the city, so you'd be looking at a rezone, and I mean, because they're Yeoman's doesn't come close to meeting any city street standard, and I think the county would be concerned with that as well, and the county would be concerned with an additional well out there and septic, and so. I
Be a mess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Or do you have anything else? Oh,
So I think that they were just looking for a general recommendation. It eventually, I think, goes on to city council to work out the agreement, and you have to do an ordinance, but that's at the county level. I think it'll be done with maybe a development agreement just to adopt this section of the county's code. So just wanted to pass on maybe a recommendation from the commission.
So another question, just to clarify for me.
Yeah.
So this would only actually be in force while the property is in the area of impact, but out of the city.
Yeah.
If it gets annexed into the city,
Then it would
they
be
come under our
rules.
non-conforming.
Yeah. But we'll see where we end up with our rules.
Yeah, right.
I think what we were looking at with comparable ordinances for other jurisdictions was that to resolve that effect of you're a duplex in a single family zone, and if you get burnt down, you can't rebuild.
Yeah.
We're thinking about maybe going towards you're able to rebuild under the same footprint only if it's destroyed type of thing,
Yeah.
but by not man destroyed, but by fire or some other natural cause.
Yeah. Which
would
answers Deb's question. Once it's finally in the city, if you're limited to the footprint.
Yeah.
so from us, you would like a recommendation, or what would you like?
Yeah, I just
Does anybody
maybe
wanna
a
try to-
motion to recommend that we adopt their non-conforming section for the area city impact. Would be.
Does anybody
I
want to
move
make
that.
that? Okay. Is there a second to? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, motion carried. Thank you, Mike. I guess you can keep going. So our next item is a minor PUD amendment draft ordinance.
Well, I think at the last, I think it was maybe the meeting before last, we discussed minor PUD amendment criteria. And if you recall, Brenda Von Wondruska submitted a letter asking the commission to take a look at it, mainly for her project, the silos on Travois Way. And so we had gone over last time. I think there was an issue when you look through the criteria. We had recently gone through and updated a lot of our criteria, but we didn't look at minor amendment PUD criteria at all. And if you look at the section we had gone through and looked at, there's about 11 of them, which is a lot. Usually when we have relevant criterion standard, there's only maybe 5, 6 max. But they had some really restrictive language and percentages There's quite a bit of what appeared to be redundancy in the criteria, and so we were going to come back and take a look at what we could do to maybe increase those percentages, because the threshold is really low right now. I mean, I think the comment was made that we probably had picked this from a really somewhat larger jurisdiction that maybe has PUDs that are a lot bigger than what we typically see around here. And so I think that the one criteria that was causing Brenda a little bit of heartburn was number one, increase the proposed enclosed square footage of any category of primary use more than 5% and does not increase the dwelling unit count of the approved PUD plan by more than 1% of the final PUD approved plan. So I would say that you need 100 dwelling units in order to achieve, in order to get one through this process. And so I think that we all recognize that maybe that was a little, onerous. And then you have more criteria that are percentage based, can't increase the floor area of a use not permitted. Through the PUD process, we allow the inclusion of uses that may be not permitted within the underlying zoning district. But if you look at the PUD, it's really creating a new zone, right? And so you start to think about that one and to say that why would you draw a distinction between permitted and maybe not permitted uses, where you've looked at the original PUD proposal and recognize that maybe the uses coincide. One of our criteria is that the uses fit in with the adjacent character of the neighborhood, and so we've already kind of said that through the initial PUD approval. And so that'd be a question about why would we draw a distinction between uses that aren't permitted and uses that are permitted when you're essentially creating a new zone with that PUD. And then we have residential density 5%, which seems to conflict with number one, dwelling unit count. I mean, usually the dwelling unit count and the density are kind of one and the same. And so then the rest, I don't know that we've had any issue with the rest of them. Substantially changed bulk or clustering of the buildings, visual impact, or the theme. Those are always important. And then the major locations of lots, streets, trails, paths, environmental impact, phasing or timing. I'd say that maybe that one's a little bit less important at all of these. Density bonus, we don't want to reduce or eliminate those factors if there was a density bonus for the proposal. And so, we've gone through those. I think I talked a little bit about, well, if it doesn't meet the minor amendment criteria, then you just automatically have to go through a major amendment. So it's like starting from scratch, and you have all these requirements. So you have the 15-day neighborhood meeting, you've got the 30-day notice before planning and zoning for the preliminary, and then you've got another, if there's a subdivision associated with it, then you go to city council. If not, the last project we reviewed last meeting, that won't go to city council because there's no subdivision associated with it. It's a type 1. So but if there is a subdivision, then you've got another 15-day notice. And then after all that's completed, you have to go back through a final application, and that gets reviewed by P&Z, and then it goes on to council if it's a subdivision as well. So, you're looking at, potentially 4 months of, going through that process again if it doesn't meet the minor amendment criteria. So I had gone out and done a little bit of research on the way other jurisdictions handle these, and most jurisdictions in Idaho have some type of ability to do a plan unit development, but I guess some of them have the minor and the major amendments. Some of them just amend, and so they don't, it's the same process no matter what. And so, going through maybe some of the ones that have the division of minor and major like we do, the best examples, looked at Post Falls, and we didn't, there's probably about half a dozen in the state of Idaho that I was able to find that actually have the minor and the major. The rest of them really just have one process for amending any PUD. They don't draw the distinction.
Well, this one looks like it would be good because it really leaves it up to the discretion of staff essentially.
Yeah, it could be good and bad. You know? It's good and bad because
that's right.
I
mean, for the minor.
Yeah, it does, and that's kind of the common theme with a lot of these is that. They obviously submit the request to the zoning administrator, and then the zoning administrator determines if it's minor or major. It's always good to have some type of criteria there, just so it doesn't feel like we're, whichever direction the wind's blowing that day, to hang our hats on. But, the way it looks, at least with the ones we've researched in Idaho, was that zoning administrator makes the decision whether it's a minor or major, and then the minor can be approved administratively. So, right now the minor would come to Planning and Zoning Commission. It's not a public hearing. It's just a review by the commission, and then the major would just the process that I described the slide before. So, the zoning administrator approves the minor, and then if it's a major, then they would just go through the typical quasi-judicial procedures. Most of these don't require you to go through the entire process. Our process is a lot lengthier than a lot of these. A lot of it goes to Planning and Zoning Commission and then City Council. But a lot of these would say that, well, if it's a major, then it just gets referred to City Council at maybe one meeting. It doesn't really specify whether or not it's a public hearing or not, which, if it's a major amendment, I think it should be. So that's what Post Falls did. Ketchum is really the same. They have provide a little bit more detail as to the location, siting, character of the buildings and structures. Maybe authorized by the zoning administrator. Then they usually have this clause about if required by engineering or other circumstances. So maybe you have a PUD that goes through and there's some things that you didn't consider, or that they do the construction drawings and there's some limiting factor, as sewer or natural features or soils, whatever it could be. That they give the zoning administrator the discretion in order to approve it as a minor amendment. And then they go on, if it's if the zoning administrator determines any proposed change may have a significant impact on the approved project, administrator may decline it. Administrator that approves such change shall forward the same to the City Council for consideration. So for that being the case of maybe a major amendment is to forward it on to City Council. Haley, pretty similar, almost the same as Post Falls and Ketchum. Forward it on to City Council for consideration. Sun Valley, now they have they've got minor and major as well, and they actually define what major amendments are. And I looking at our ordinance, I think that you can do one or the other. If it meets this criteria, it's a minor. If it meets this, it's a major. But it almost seems to make more sense to us to say that, well, if it meets this criteria, it's a major, instead of if it doesn't meet this criteria, then it's a major type of thing. So that may be something to look at, is shifting it over to, well, this is the criteria you need to meet for a major. If it's not, doesn't meet this criteria, then you're automatically a minor. So just one of those.
And for the
differences.
minor, are you recommending, instead of what Post Falls and Haley have, and Sun Valley, having it be an administrative decision or at the administrator's discretion to still run it through us, not through the whole process, but have P&Z look at it, or rather than having an administrative judgment call? Where are you headed with that?
Well, I think that after reviewing all of these, none of them have minor amendments going to a commission. So that's something that right now we have them just going to the commission, but it's just a regular. A lot of them are really minor, and I'm thinking back to the ones that we've processed in the past. We've had PUDs, and a lot of them have been PUDs that are associated with subdivisions. And I think there's a little bit of a difference there. If you have a subdivision that's also a PUD and a large portion of it's built out, you've got a lot of different owners in there that have vested interest in that development. Whereas if you had maybe one development like the silos, obviously you've got, maybe whoever owns the development, but then you have people that are leasing spaces within there that don't actually own the property. They're just lessees of the property. And so, I think you've got a little bit of a difference there. I think that's why we draw the distinction between a Type 1 and a Type 2 early on in the code, to say a Type 1 just goes to Planning and Zoning Commission and that's it, and Type 2, if it's with a subdivision plat, it goes to City Council. And there's other reasons for that, for going to City Council with a subdivision. There's state code requirements for it, but so I think it's a little bit different. You have ones, I think we had one in Greensides up on North Polk, that there was a setback waiver request that we processed as a minor PUD amendment. The property was right up against a detention pond, and so it really didn't affect the rest of the development that much. That seems like something reasonable that staff could just administratively approve. We don't see any issue with that one. The ones that I guess concern me a little bit are like Tampo Commons. They've gone through quite a few minor PUD amendments there, and it's just been slight variations. Like they went through, all the houses are 2 stories. They went through an iteration that allowed a L-shaped configuration. I think they called it a Z-lot, but it was more of a single-story house design that they were trying to cater to a different demographic. Maybe an older generation that just wants a single level home. And then at one point, the ability to do twin homes were approved in there, although they didn't build any. They did build some of those L-shaped lots, but that didn't require any public hearing. So everybody that's already built their house in the development and own a house and live there had no idea that amendment was going through, and somebody could all of a sudden change the vision that they had bought into. So I think that in those circumstances, that I think that whatever we do for the minor amendment criteria, that there should be maybe one criteria that gives staff the flexibility of looking at the situation, and maybe it's one of those subdivision examples where we could still carry it through as maybe a public hearing. So that was just.
So multiple ownership is involved.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of hard to draw a distinction in an ordinance, but I think that when you have that interest of multiple property owners that have bought into that vision, and it's a larger development like that I think that you owe it to them in order to at least allow them to come and give their input on something that may happen that may affect the vision of what they thought they were buying into through that development. So that. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to continue on.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to say that now the way I remember it, what tangled up Brenda is she wanted to move a commercial space to another residential space.
Yeah, it was she had a commercial space on the ground floor, currently being used as an office, and wanted to have a change of use to allow another apartment on that ground floor. Yeah. And the end goal is to just make the development completely residential. Right. But there's a hairdresser there, the hairstylist in one of the buildings that I think has a couple more years left before she retires, and so they're not completely there to 100% residential. It's in an R4 zone, so it allows multifamily. And so the question was that if they wanted to convert it to all, they could essentially vacate, I guess, the PUD, because the development would meet all of the development standards of the R4 zone. It meets all the height, all those requirements. It's just that they went through the PUD in order to do this mixed-use development, and that, if they decided that didn't work for them and they wanted to go strictly towards residential, whether or not that was, that's what we talked about last time. I guess we didn't really have an issue with that. It was just that how do we craft the language and so it's such that it may make sense for her project, but on the larger scale, maybe Tampo Commons, one of these larger subdivision PUDs, maybe it would work for her, but maybe all of a sudden it would be introducing, something that may affect another PUD. And so, looking through those first criteria with all the percentages, it just, probably an hour of just reading through each one over and over again, and then you really just have to start from scratch and try to figure it out. But we thought we'd just go through and take a look at, maybe it's just another approach that we need to take, and we'll see what other jurisdictions are doing, and then come back and see what we can do.
Well, I was just noticing, like in that number 1 on Sun Valley, if you change mix of uses.
Yeah, and that's what you find. You have, I guess that's kind of the theme. Is if it's really minor, then that's just administrative. But on the majority of these, if you increase the density, if you change any of the uses, they're almost always kicking you into a major amendment. And so, what you fall back on is that. When you start to think about some of those larger PUDs, that it really could have an effect on those, even though it may not have. It seems reasonable. It seems like the right thing to do on the silos development.
Yeah, right.
And so I think that looking through these, and we'll just finish them all out. But that's really the common theme, is that you have minor amendments that are approved administratively. You have a little bit of discretion from the zoning administrator in order to determine whether it's minor or major. Some of them are real general, and they don't even give any criteria for being in a major amendment, and some of them do. They don't have near the amount that we do. We have 11, and a lot of these, the most they have are maybe 4 or 5. So I think that can be cleaned up. And I think that it's onerous to have a major amendment go all the way through the neighborhood meeting, the public hearing before Planning and Zoning Commission for preliminary, and then final plat or final PUD through P&Z as well. Yeah. So, I think that the neighborhood meeting's intended to introduce the project, and I think that a lot of these, the project is almost already completed, and maybe they're making a modification. So I don't see any reason why you would have to do another neighborhood meeting. I think a lot of these, they just have one public hearing before City Council or Planning and Zoning Commission, and I think that should be the direction that we go. Is have minor amendments, maybe keep them, simplify the language, keep it the kind of the way it is, increase those percentages. But a lot of these, you see a 5% increase is about the top, which would allow maybe a couple units for a Tampo type development, but you're for a silos project that maybe, Brenda can correct me, probably has 12 dwelling units maybe. Looking at, in order to get one more, you probably need a 20% increase in order to do that. And so you look at the effect on maybe what other PUDs, and so I think that maybe the direction we go is simplify the language. Have the minor amendments be staff, have staff be able to approve those, and then with the major amendments, have it be one public hearing before whoever the decision-making body was, in this case Planning and Zoning Commission, or if it was a subdivision, then it's one public hearing before Planning and Zoning Commission. So, you get a 15-day notice, and instead of spending 4 months going all the way back through the process, you get it accomplished in 3 weeks. With a major amendment. So, that after going through all of these and looking at what everybody else did, that seemed the most reasonable to us, looking through it. But, it's really the direction the commission wants to go.
Well, I had a question about what would be the advantage or disadvantage of just, in the case of smaller PUDs, that look for changes where the percentages will never work. I mean, you know, you'd have to be at 50% almost, and well, not 50, but 20. What would be the disadvantage of just vacating the PUD, or is the idea to reserve the flexibility that if the economic circumstances change, you could go back to allowing commercial?
Well, I think that vacation of the PUD is always an option. It's just that it doesn't fit within their schedule of, you know, I mean, they still want the hair salon to be there.
Yeah, okay.
And so that would be the issue with vacating the PUD, is that you have a hair salon we allow professional offices in R4, but we don't allow hair salons. And so that would be the issue, is that you'd have a use that wouldn't be allowed, and so you really wouldn't be able to vacate it. I mean, we talked about that too, that, you know, is there a process? Well, I mean, we haven't done a vacation of a PUD before, and they're not very common.
I was just,
the only ones that,
yeah,
if you look for any, the only ones that are common are in Jackson Hole area, Teton County, where they had all the subdivisions that were platted. And I think they call them ghost subdivisions now,
yes,
you know, they have all these platted. Yeah, it was when they were just approving sprawling subdivisions, and then the housing bubble hit, and they all crashed, and they never got developed. Well, it's ones that aren't developed. You know, usually with silos, it's developed, and they're wanting to maybe vacate the PUD at the end of development. Well, these haven't been developed yet, and so they haven't followed through on the development agreement in order to construct all the infrastructure to the subdivision that they were required to do as part of the development agreement. And so now the county's actually going through and requiring them to vacate the approval because they haven't held up their end of the bargain for you know, extending the city services out there. So
it's a forced vacation.
It's a forced vacation. Yeah, I haven't been able to find any examples of ones that are the developer requesting the vacation. You know, we could certainly, we'll certainly end up having to go through that process if that's what you know, Brenda ends up wanting to do in the end. But yeah, it's you know, we don't really have a roadmap of what that looks like.
Something that does make sense to me, like Brenda's wanting to increase the residential portion. Well, R4 is residential, so that to me makes sense, not to be prohibitive with that. But if she wanted to do the opposite, and she wanted to put a lot more retail in there, then it makes sense to me that there's some sort of limiting factor, because that's really changing. You know, there was a specific amount of retail to start with when that was approved. But to increase that portion, which is not within that zoning district, then to me that really should have some sort of limit on it, because that does change the neighborhood.
Yeah, but you think about Tampo. I think that increasing the dwelling units there could, some would argue that would negatively affect their development, and their underlying zone would be R4, which would allow multifamily. And so, you know, and then it's kind of struggling with the fact that when you go through a PUD, it's pretty much a rezone. They don't really, I mean, they have the underlying zone R4, but you really have a new zone that you've created on top of that. That becomes your zone, because you went through that process, and you've got certain exceptions, and you did certain things in order to get uses that weren't allowed.
So it's like an unnamed zone.
And so it's, yeah, I mean, so that'd be the question, is do we need to rezone it back to R4, you know, when we do this? And, you know, looking at maybe, you know, and I haven't been able to find any examples of vacating PUDs and codes either about what you need to do. And I mean, it you know, we even talked about maybe the opportunity to, well, what's to say that maybe they couldn't vacate it now, and then all of a sudden the hair salon just becomes a non-conforming use, and we handle that through the non-conforming section, or maybe the PUD section, where it says that, well, you vacated this PUD, so now you're a legal non-conforming use, which means you're allowed to continue with that use, and then 2 years from now they could come in and change the use to the R4 residential. I mean, we've talked about all that, and we really don't know. As far as the vacation and non-conforming, there's nothing that we could really find that even addresses that, and so those are all kind of questions that we need to work through. But aside from that, just looking at other jurisdictions and what they do and what seems the most reasonable and what doesn't seem reasonable is kind of what we got right now, with having to go through all the way back through the process and having the minor amendment so stringent.
Yeah, so let me see if I understand this. So if, hypothetically speaking, somebody wanted to vacate an office and turn it into a dwelling unit in a PUD, it would still be considered a major amendment, but it would be like a 15-day process to deal with it instead of the 4-month process?
The direction we're going is, obviously you guys can go whichever direction you want, but looking at this, and I think what we, after we went round and round with the criteria, and went round and round with, well, you've already got the development, and why can't you just put the residential unit in here? And even though it was a commercial office before, that I think that in order to preserve these larger PUDs and not just have we want flexibility. We don't want to have people go through a process that they don't need to go through. And so, moving the minor amendment to just planning administrators, just discretion. It seems like in those circumstances where you have Tampo and they're introducing twin homes and it doesn't meet the threshold, I think that those should be a public hearing. But Brenda's, I don't necessarily think that should be a public hearing. I think that staff should be able to do that, but it's trying to balance both of them.
So that it sounds to you like that should count as a minor amendment.
It should, but it's virtually impossible to craft the language in order to have it fall into a minor amendment without having a major effect on the larger PUDs. So that's what we ran into, and so that I think is where we arrived at was, well, we can simplify the minor, we can make it administrative, and then we can also so that may kick more projects into the major. It won't, because we're simplifying the minor, so it'll still have projects go to the major, but we'll have it'll just be one hearing before the decision-making body that approved the initial one. So, if it was Planning and Zoning Commission, then we just have one public hearing, 15-day notice, and then they have the hearing, and then approve it approve or deny that night. And instead of this 4-month process that we have now, making you start from the very beginning and go back through all the painful, neighborhood meeting and all that, it would just be one review, public hearing that would, you could accomplish it in 3 to 4 weeks.
So all major amendments then just come in for one hearing in front of me.
Public hearing.
Public hearing.
Yeah.
Would there be any use in distinguishing smaller some kind of threshold of square footage in the PUDs that would kick them into one category or another in terms of change? But since the ratios or the percentages get kind of skewed with smaller developments.
I was thinking of intensity of use. So like Brenda's wanting to go downward in the intensity of the use.
Right.
And your example about Tampo Commons, since it's really underlying R4, if someone was proposing to do a more intensive use, that's actually upping does that make sense? So that should, in my mind, take more of a process than gearing downward within the underlying.
Yeah, but they're both increasing the density, so that's what.
Not so much increases in density, but changes of use. I think what you're talking about. It seems that
Well,
one of the criteria
Yeah.
that the administrator could use in the decision as to whether it's major or minor is whether the proposed changes are in the direction of the underlying zone or in the other direction, especially in terms of use. So if Tampo Commons wanted to put in 25 offices, that would be a move contrary to the underlying zone and would be a flag for the zoning administrator to declare it major.
It's kind of like it would be nice if you'd figured out how to craft in the language a one-way gate, where if you're going more towards like what the neighborhood, what the underlying area is, that would be okay. If you're trying to up it, moving further away, that would not be okay.
Yeah, I think that's what the existing criteria has tried to do, like with number 3, increase floor area of a use not permitted in the underlying zone by more than 1%. Some of these are up to 5%, so, we could have different percentages for uses that are in the underlying zone. Could be
So there's where it would
higher
make sense
threshold.
to me, not to interrupt, but if Tampo Commons did not have anything in the initial PUD that talked about like a multifamily, it's R4 out there, but that wasn't part of the plan, is to have an apartment complex, right? So that would stop it. Number 3 would stop that because that would change the tone of that whole PUD.
Well, two would stop that.
Two
because
would-
it
two
would
would
be
stop it.
would be an allowed use. Yeah.
2 would, yeah. But if
So
they
it-
wanted to do something that they had not proposed ever, that to me makes, 'cause that's what people have not counted on.
If the silos wanted to convert it all to offices,
Right.
for example,
Right.
that would
Yeah.
be major.
Yeah. and-
Brenda's waving her hands back.
Yeah.
yeah. Come on.
Yes.
Yeah, come up.
Come on up to the table if you want.
I'm just thinking that it could be easy if you said something like if it complies with the underlying code, because if you're if we don't want to change anything except the use, then you don't have to be afraid that there's going to be a huge apartment building. But if you say you can change the uses as long as it complies with the existing underlying code and not the change of zoning, I mean, you're thinking when you go for a PUD, you're changing into another zone.
huge, yeah.
But if you want to just comply with what you would have been allowed if you hadn't done the PUD,
Well,
that's simple.
but think about Tampo Commons. Okay, you could do apartments there. So would that be a minor amendment to say that all of a sudden you bought a house in there and you went through this? They went through this process.
And
I
then you start
approved it
building
because
it.
it made a minor, and then all of a sudden you've got a 4-story apartment building being built right next to your house.
Well, we were just going to change that first one about the percentages, about the use.
Yeah,
So if
and-
you're going to change all the others, because if you put an apartment building there, you would be substantially changing the way it looks.
Yeah.
And you'd have to change the way people are allowed to build, the building envelopes and so on. There would be a lot more changes than simply change. And also, it would be nice if you allowed a mixed use, and this is a different subject, if you allowed a mixed use and then let people switch around. Because we were foolish in the way we designed that. And you only realize it afterwards.
Well, to me, that would be the advantage of keeping the PUD instead of vacating it, obviously,
Yeah.
is you'd have the flexibility to meet future economic
Yeah, so
market
you-
changes
yeah.
or whatever.
So you can't just now shuffle it around. You can't say, because you have to, when you do the PUD, say this is where this is going to be and that's where that's going to be. And the way we designed it, there should be some separation between residential and office spaces because of privacy issues with people. So being able to stay with what's been approved, not increase the numbers, but just shift it around so it makes more sense for people who live there.
So you want to go to residential and not ever go back to commercial?
I'd like to reserve the right to keep that one, because there are three
Yeah,
little buildings.
no, I would too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and so to have the offices in the little buildings and not where they are, where Ron Landek's office now is in what everything else is residential. And so people think they can sit outside someone else's apartment and smoking cigarettes and,
Yeah.
just
And
because
he-
it appears to
yeah.
the public.
And they would be allowed some professional office, so like Landek's office, if it's less than 2,000 square feet, he'd be allowed to be there underneath that zone. It's just the hairdresser, or the hair salon.
But
that's
from
the
a
issue.
practical design livability point of view, that was not smart. We should have put that in the different building, in one of the smaller locations. And we found that out just by the way people live. And the way people, pathways, people choose their pathways. It doesn't matter where the pathway is.
That's true.
And so that is people's patios are a pathway. So that's where, and if we could say silos residents only on a little sign, that would solve the problem. Right now with the office there, we can't say that because people want to come in and write their wills, so it was a design flaw is basically why we need to do it. But we would be complying with the underlying code, and I think if you just use that language, as long as it complies with the underlying code.
That works for you, though, but in the Tampo Commons situation, that would open a can of worms there.
Aren't they all platted out? So if they wanted a big multi-family building, they'd have to replat that, and then you're into a whole different, or not.
I think you could probably do a triplex or something on one of those lots. Fit that on there.
Are they big enough? Yeah.
290 square feet's the minimum lots or square footage for a dwelling.
Yeah, somebody would figure out a way to do it.
And with all due respect, there are times when staff members, I would not want to allow them to use their discretion. But I think in the way it is set up right now, that would be a real good answer. Because the way that department is right now, everybody's completely professional and knows what they're doing. But there have been times when it hasn't been that way, in my opinion.
So if in the original CUP, could you do something like, say, we want 3 units that can be either commercial or residential, depending on the situation?
Well, I think I mean, the commission has the authority to approve that, and I think that you do have some, like the one that was Mike McCoy's, his studio. I think that on the plans they said something like artists, some type of office / residential, and I mean, I think you could. I remember that's the way I remember looking at the plans. It said, given the option, it could either be these 2 uses in there. It'll obviously building code. It'll affect building code.
Yeah.
So when you go back and forth, the separation is gonna be different. But yeah, when they go through the process, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to have, residential / office in this space and have some flexibility to it.
The part that was what we were asking for in that planned unit development was the retail space, and those we had to specify specifically where they were going to be. But it would be nice if you specified where they were going to be and then reserved the right to change them.
Yeah.
During the process, saying this is where we think they're going to be, this is where we've shown you they're going to be, but we reserve the right to move them to another location.
Yeah.
And the X number of them, can we move them around?
Yeah, I certainly can't see any difficulty with doing that on an original PhD. Or PhD.
So you're being a PhD.
But
Yeah, it would have only taken 10 years worth of looking into the future. It's coming. Yeah.
But what do you think about, if it ends up being a major, Brenda?
Oh,
Yeah,
no,
you can't leave
it
it.
ended up being
And we revised the process to just go through one public hearing before whoever approves, so Planning and Zoning Commission.
I think if you say it's a minor and you go to the same commission that approved it originally, because then there's some history of what was approved and you have an opportunity to explain exactly what you want to do. But I do think a hearing is important, because then, although it's cumbersome, but then you prevent changing the code to accommodate Tampo from becoming something different. If you say, right, you want to make this what you're calling a minor change, but you need to explain it. And then a commission can use some discretion rather than a staff person.
Okay.
I mean, I'm having
Is
this horrible concept of a minor major change.
But I think using your discretion about whether it's minor or major, taking one of these examples, not the Moscow example, but the Post Falls or one of the others, and then you decide it's a minor. You don't have to start all over with this public hearing, neighborhood meeting, but you do need to go back to the entity that approved the project and ask them what they think.
Well, what do you think about changing the major amendment to just, instead of starting from the beginning, going all the way through the neighborhood meeting and the 2 hearings before planning and zoning, to just one meeting, one public hearing before planning and zoning?
Mm-hmm.
But what if it's really major?
Yeah.
I mean, so I think there still needs to be some kind of threshold. Or I'm worried that there might need to be.
If you're going to make a major amendment, it's going to be difficult, given how rigid it is to meet all those criteria.
I'm thinking of the large apartment building in a PUD that's a plant that people bought into.
There's
thinking
already some
right?
residents, owners in the PUD.
Right.
They certainly should have notice.
Yeah.
They also, if we were to change the exterior part of our building, our neighbors would have a fit. So it gets, like I said to Mike, it gets extremely complicated when you start looking at different examples. And if you think, well, we just want to change this to that and it's not a big deal, but because our neighbors did not like this in the first place, if we changed something on the exterior, they would not be happy. And they would want a public hearing. They would want to be noticed. They'd want to speak out. So I suppose if you want to get complicated, it could be interior or exterior changes.
But if we're talking about one public hearing, you still have to notice the property owners, right? Surrounding property owners. I mean,
No, you wouldn't say.
For the direction we're going for the major, it would be a public hearing, so everybody would be noticed within 600 feet. For the minor, right now we don't notice anybody. That's kind of been the issue with like the Tampo Commons ones, that they submit the application and we don't notice anybody, and then you review it, and it's just whoever submitted it that's here talking about why they want to do it, and nobody else that is already
Gotcha.
invested type of thing.
Go ahead if you.
Well, and then what we were running into was the whole increase in residential density. I mean, if you look at trying to, just look at, well, you have a building that's already built, and I think everybody recognizes that there should be maybe some flexibility in order to be able to shift uses in there. But there's no way that you can have, looking at all these criteria, they all have some type of threshold for density increases that, kick it into a minor or major amendment. And so, we could say that, well, it's if you do that on the inside of the building, it's all right, but regardless, you're going to have a density increase because you're going to add an apartment. You know, you're going to add another unit in there, and so then you try to, you're trying to form a code around, this specific circumstance, and then it just becomes, you start to think about all the other implications, and it's, and so that's what we've been beating ourselves up for the last.
That's where a form-based code would let you just change the use without worrying about it. I mean, as long as keeps the same envelope, and it's not the case in the major ones that you're talking about. So.
Yeah,
As a realtor, sorry.
Yeah, I'm a little worried, kind of like you are, of if somebody wanted to make some really major changes, and they happen to know that they have a compliant planning and zoning commission. I don't like the idea of it being one hearing with a 15-day notice.
Still has to go through city council, though, right?
Well, not if it's a.
Not if it's no.
Yeah,
Okay.
it doesn't. Well, I would say that if in staff's review of that, if it's substantially different than, I mean, there's a point where there's obviously a new proposal. Yeah. As opposed to what they've done before. So I think that you rely on staff to inform them that it's way beyond an amendment to what they currently have, and they need to go back all the way through the beginning of the process and the neighborhood meeting and all of that. So
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Could the commission recommend that this go before the city council in the one hearing method?
It could get appealed to city council, but I don't know that you would have the authority to move it on without that specifically being in the code to say that you can.
So. I don't know what to recommend.
Could you go farther afield in your looking at other communities that maybe have had more PUD experience and maybe have?
Yeah, we could certainly do more research. I had we're down a staff member now, so I didn't get as far as I would have hoped, but yeah, we could certainly look into that. I was more just not bringing you a final product, just kind of what our observations are and what we've run into when we're looking at it. I mean,
it is
just
because I don't know. I can't see how you're going to identify the triggers between one and the other. If that's still a blur to me. Yeah. Other than just your discretion, which is fine with me since you're really good at having good discretion. But somebody might be in your position who's not at some point.
Part of the deal is you have to promise to live forever.
When you talk about density as realtors, there's a huge problem with accessory dwelling units because people think they're living in single-family residential neighborhoods, but if you can have accessory dwelling units, you're really having duplexes in residential neighborhoods. So you've got to think through what you're allowing really carefully.
We got that through that pretty extensively over several years. It was ongoing before, and also just the percentage, the restrictions we put on it in terms of the size of the ADU, the number of people who can live in it, and the owner occupancy requirement. All of those are a lot different than a duplex.
Yeah, no, but in effect, because people tend to rent just on the ground. When a seller will often think, "Wow, I have this valuable asset," and then neighbors hate it, and then it's
What did you say? And then what?
Neighbors do not like it because although you have to provide the parking space, and you often have a lot more vehicles parked on the street. Just the de facto reality of what happens as opposed to what it was intended to be. But I like Mike's first proposal.
Well, just to be clear, I wasn't saying that what we were recommending was to say that it was just going to be staff's discretion. It was going to be, potentially staff's discretion considering criteria. So not just open-ended like these that just says, staff can approve it, but it gives no threshold as to whether or not it's minor or major, just staff's discretion. It would be, to keep the criteria we have, revise those, simplify those maybe down to 4 or 5, and then have, staff, if it meets minor, be able to approve that administratively.
That your discretion
And
is
then-
to decide if it's meeting the minor criteria.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. But you have criteria.
Right.
You don't just say that, well, this is a minor change or this is a
Because I
major
feel
change.
like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my Uncle Fred's proposal is just really so minor.
Well, because we would get exactly that. We would say that Brenda could change the signing of the silos, and then we'd have the church in the next day saying that they thought that was a major change, and that's not a fun place to be in the middle of something like that. So,
But if the criteria are very clear,
Yeah.
then
yeah. So I can, if that seems reasonable, the direction we're going, I can keep researching some maybe larger places that handle more PUDs and
who've had more of the problems crop up so that they've figured out an answer to them, maybe. I don't know.
and keep on thinking about ways where we can allow uses to maybe shift on the inside of already built buildings, but still have some type of density restriction on. It'll just be trying to work through that. So
Right, without customizing to one circumstance, so then it makes it a mess for everything else.
I mean,
So-
would it make sense to do something along the lines of change by 1 or a certain percentage? See what I mean? So if you have a really small, like in this situation, where you're changing the density of the dwelling units by 1, and then you use the percentage to capture the bigger PUDs.
Yeah, it just becomes tough to draw a distinction.
It is.
Well,
That's why they went to the percentages, because no matter what the scale of the project is, that percentage always is the same.
But in this
regardless.
case, like I think Deb said earlier, it's downzoning to what was allowed in this underlying zone. If it was going the other way, then it would
And I like
jump
that,
into the
what she
major.
said. That's a good
major-
start right there.
Yeah.
Whether it's minor or major, I would think.
Yeah, well, but once you start pulling on that string, it gets more complicated.
Well,
I don't
Tampo
think-
Commons,
because then-
even though
yeah.
the Tampo Commons
If this is what
underlying
we're gonna
zone
do.
is R4, that's
I'd
not
say
how it
wipe
was
them out and
planned.
Just have major and
So to me, that
Go
says,
through the process.
if you want to go that direction, now you're talking major because
Yeah.
you've set a tone
Right.
that you didn't do anything that was really R4. Now that you want to do R4, that's not minor.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You have, I mean, that's a good example because you have an R4 zone, but they've done a PUD and it's all single family. So you're looking at
So maybe
R2.
it's changes that reflect, if it's changes that reflect the character of what has been built
Of the PUD.
in the PUD, rather than what the underlying zone was, because that would be more encompassing.
Which we've successfully circled back to, yes, it's its own zone.
But like Brenda's area, that's maybe R4, but she was doing commercial activity. That's, in my mind, that's a higher intensity use than residential. Even though R4 is the highest residential use, you're still, to want to have an additional apartment is less intensive in my brain than having a commercial activity going there. But I don't know. So how could anybody complain about that, I guess, is how it would look to me.
Somebody wants a cup of coffee and there's no coffee shop there.
Yeah, that's like-
So we'll continue on and then hopefully have something. We will
Next meeting. Okay, that'd be great to be able to look at a few more examples, because I think we're not feeling like we have our arms around this completely yet.
Yeah.
In terms of
I don't understand it. Before everything, it was R4. And then you had a PUD come in there to allow commercial businesses, and now we're down to one business in there. I really don't see why we're even doing anything, since it was already R4. And now it's just kind of morphing back into R4 without.
Yeah, but it's not completely there. You know, they still have the salon that would still be there. That
Well, it's not
would
completely
be
there,
the
but
issue.
it was mixed uses before, so why does that matter? I guess that's what I don't understand.
Mainly just because they went through the PUD in order to have that salon there, as well as some other retail uses that.
It was special permission in a sense in order to do that project the way it is. So to ask to undo it.
I mean, that's one of the options is to
But she doesn't want to do that.
But-
She would like to, at this point, still have that flexibility.
Yeah, flexibility. Which that's what mixed use is, I would think, would be flexibility.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
is there a certain percentage of mixed use, commercial, residential? Is that what it?
Well, R4 just allows 2,000 square feet of professional office would be the only mixed use they would allow.
so you can't have a hair salon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Without a conditional use permit, right? Or would
I
you
just-
even be able
they
to do it?
wouldn't be able to allow it at all.
Not at all,
That's
yeah.
really, I think, the only reason they went through the PUD was in order to do that.
Yeah. And so it's like, they've just gone through the let's make a deal session with the city. So to change the deal,
Yeah.
you have to, and we have to write the rules and regulations such that everybody operates under the same ones. So, what fits for the silos also has to fit for Tampo,
Yeah.
Well, Mike, see if you can find some really excellent examples of PUDs that are experiencing
You're doing an excellent
communities
job.
that have more press on their PUDs than we do in terms of change. And maybe that'll help us.
Thanks for stirring things up.
Yeah, yeah, it's complicated for a little development. It's very complex.
Setting precedent.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I guess that's all we have on the agenda, right? Or did you have anything else?
Yeah, I think so. I meant to read Victoria's email
right.
earlier on landscaping for parking lots, but I can read that now. She had forwarded over I don't know if some of you saw, I think it was a Sightline Institute article. They kind of pull articles from the Northwest generally and send out every day an email. And there was an article about pollinators and about landscaping that promotes pollination and kind of the dwindling bee population in the world these days. And so she has had some comments about our work on parking lot landscaping. So I just read her email. Keep in mind David Rock's suggestion to include the option or urging or whatever to take two adjacent linear strips, fold one over to abut the other to form a square instead of a long linear strip. You wouldn't lose hardly any parking, if any, but trees do better in a square than a strip. Not sure if you're discouraging or banning lawn in island and rocks. You decide. Rocks with shrubs like the ground-hugging juniper, probably okay. Lawns are a waste of water, mowing, etc. Both might get weed sprayed, but I don't like because it's poison and affects the insect life, such as bees. Go as far with these angles as is appropriate and convincing to City Council. Can you include the idea of to consider things like one walk down the middle and landscape on both sides? You noted that in the Walmart there's two strips. It had two walks outside and the vegetation strip down the middle. It's cheaper for developers to do one walk, which is plenty, and better to avenue it with trees and such outside the walk next to the lot. Off the top of my head, those points come to me. Tree islands are very important for all the reasons y'all are working on this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess just a reminder that the shared reading is up on the website, or the links to it are up on the website, and we meet again August, I don't have a calendar in front of me. August something. August 10th. So hopefully if we have room on the agenda, we would put some time for shared reading discussion then.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're not meeting on the 27th, so I guess adjournment. Thank you, everybody.